I stood in the hallway that night and heard her laugh, the kind of laugh that cuts deeper than any knife. And then she said it, clear as day, she's just a glorified babysitter, free childcare, nothing more. She didn't know I was there, standing just a few steps away, holding a folded towel in my hands, my heart sinking as her words echoed through me. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just stood still and thought, after all these years, after all I've given, is that really how she sees me? And in that moment, I knew something inside me had shifted forever. Thank you for watching and for being here with me today. I truly appreciate your time, and please tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know. My name is Margaret, and this is not an easy story for me to share, but it is mine, and it has been heavy on my heart for too long. For 6 years I woke up at 6 in the morning to get everything ready, the lunches packed, the uniforms laid out, the kitchen warm with the smell of breakfast before anyone else's alarm had even gone off. I cooked, I cleaned, I ironed, I stayed up through long nights with fevers, and sat quietly in the audience at recitals, clapping until my hands stung because I wanted her to know I was proud. I wiped tears and sticky fingers, listened to worries whispered in the dark, and gave every ounce of myself, because I believed I was needed. I believed I was loved for what I gave and who I was. She would tell me, I couldn't have done it without you. And every time she said it, I believed her. I carried those words like they were proof that all of my sacrifices mattered, that my role in her life was more than duty, more than convenience. But standing in that hallway the other night, hearing her words, I realized how fragile those thank yous had been, how quickly they could be broken by laughter and careless dismissal. And that is why I need to tell you this story, because sometimes the deepest cuts don't come from strangers. They come from the very people you once held closest. I often think back to the years before everything soured, the years when I believed my presence in that house was a blessing rather than a burden, when I believed my hands, my time, and my love were seen and cherished. Life had not always been easy for me. I had worked hard all my life, stretching every dollar, pushing through illnesses I never had the time to rest from, learning how to live with less so that my family could have more. I carried those lessons into my later years, and when she asked me to step in, when she told me she needed help, I did not hesitate for a second. I said yes, because that is what love does. It shows up, it sacrifices, it stays even when it is tired. And I gave myself fully, day after day, year after year, until those days bled into 6 long years where my identity was wrapped up in service, where my life was measured by school bells, by after-school snacks, by piles of laundry that seemed endless, and by the quiet joy of being there to steady a home that would have otherwise fallen apart. I told myself that my sacrifices were seeds, that they would grow into respect, into gratitude, into moments where my daughter would look at me and see the woman who had held her when she was small, who had worked double shifts to pay for her shoes, who had carried her dreams on my back without complaint. I thought that by showing up for her and her family, I was reminding her of the roots she had come from, of the values I had taught her, of the simple truth that family takes care of family. Yet slowly, over time, I began to notice small cracks, little dismissive looks, half-hearted thank yous. Moments when she would roll her eyes if I didn't fold the towels exactly the way she liked, or when she would sigh heavily, as though my presence was more of an obligation than a comfort. At first, I brushed it off, convincing myself she was tired, that she was stressed, that she didn't mean it the way it sounded, and I buried those hurts deep inside, telling myself not to be sensitive. But deep down, I felt the shift. I felt how the warmth of our bond was thinning, how my role was being reshaped into something smaller, something that looked less like love and more like duty, less like being a mother and more like being an employee who had never signed up for wages. And yet I kept giving, because I told myself love would win in the end, that my dedication would be enough to hold us together, that one day she would look back and realize the depth of what I had done. That night in the hallway, when her words rang out like a cruel sentence, I understood all those little cracks had not been accidents, they had been warnings, and I had ignored them until they broke me wide open. That night, when the words cut through the air and settled heavy in my chest, I felt a silence inside me that was louder than any argument I could have started. I stood there in the hallway with the folded towel still in my hands, and for a moment, it was as if the years all replayed themselves in front of me. Every early morning, every weary night, every sacrifice I had made, and yet all of it had been reduced to a joke, to a laugh that carried no respect, no acknowledgement of who I truly was. I wanted to speak, to ask her how she could say such a thing after everything I had given. But the words never left my lips, because I knew if I opened my mouth, the dam inside me might break, and I would drown in all the pain I had held back for years. So instead I walked back into the living room. I folded the last of the laundry. I laid each piece down gently, as if by caring for those clothes I could remind myself that I still knew how to give love, even when it wasn't returned. When I went upstairs, the house was quiet, the children were half asleep, and I moved softly from room to room, smoothing a blanket here, brushing a strand of hair from a forehead there, whispering a good night that would never be remembered, but meant everything to me. I paused at the youngest one's bed, looking at the thank you drawings still taped to the wall, my name written in bright crayon letters, and I thought to myself, maybe they saw me for more than what their mother claimed. Maybe my worth had not been erased in every heart under this roof. I kissed them good night with a smile that did not reach my eyes, and then I went to my own room, closed the door quietly, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. The words kept circling in my mind, each repetition sharper than the last, until I felt my body tremble not from anger, but from the weight of realization. I had given 6 years of my life to hold everything together, and in her heart I was no more than free labor, convenient, disposable, unvalued. I stayed awake long after the house had fallen into deep sleep, my eyes tracing the faint light that slipped through the curtains, and I told myself that something had ended that night. It wasn't the love I felt, because love does not vanish so quickly, but it was the illusion, the lie I had let myself live in, the belief that my sacrifices had been seen and cherished. And in the stillness of those hours, I began to understand that tomorrow could not look like yesterday, that if I kept staying, I would lose myself completely. So I sat there in the dark, making a quiet promise to myself that when the morning came, I would do something I had never done before. I would choose me. The hours stretched on through the night as I sat in the quiet of my room, the blanket pulled around my shoulders not for warmth, but for comfort. And in that silence, I let my mind wander back to all the moments that had led me here. All the sacrifices that had shaped my days into something she could dismiss so easily. I thought of the mornings when I rose before the sun, the ache in my bones that I ignored as I stood at the stove, the smell of toast and eggs filling the kitchen before the world was fully awake. And I thought of how she never once asked if I was tired, never once wondered if I needed rest. I remembered sitting in the front row at the recitals, my hands clapping until they stung, my eyes filled with pride, not just for the performance, but for the life I had helped make possible. Yet when the lights went down, she would brush past me as though my presence was nothing more than expected. I thought of the nights when fevers rose high, when I sat by the bedside with a cool cloth, whispering prayers into the darkness, my heart pounding with worry, and how she would later tell her friends she had been up all night, forgetting that I was the one who never closed my eyes. Every memory cut deeper, because each one was built on love, and now all of them were being rewritten in my mind as evidence that I had been taken for granted, used until there was nothing left of me. I sat there with my hands trembling in my lap, feeling a hollow ache in my chest that no tears could fill. And I asked myself why I had stayed so long, why I had accepted scraps of appreciation when what I gave was my whole self. Was it because I believed family would always come first, because I had raised her with the hope that she would understand sacrifice, or because I feared what my life would be if I stopped giving? The questions came heavy, one after another, and yet the answers remained locked in silence. I realized then that I had lost more than sleep. I had lost years of myself, years where I could have been living for me, where I could have been choosing joy rather than exhausting myself for someone who saw me as nothing but convenience. And still, Even with that painful truth settling over me, I felt no anger, only sorrow. The kind of sorrow that makes your chest tighten and your breath slow, because you understand something has broken that can never be repaired. I thought about confronting her, about walking into her room and demanding to know how she could laugh like that, how she could dismiss me so cruelly after all I had done. But I knew the words would not change her heart. Sometimes people do not hear what you say, they only hear what they want to believe. And in her eyes I would always be just the hand that cooked the meals and folded the laundry, never the heart that beat quietly behind it all. And so I sat there until the first light of morning crept across the floor, and I felt a calmness come over me, a certainty that the time for words had passed. What was left was action, quiet and steady, not for her sake, but for mine. It was then I decided that when the sun rose fully, I would gather my strength. And I would walk away, not with rage, not with bitterness, but with the kind of dignity that silence gives to those who have finally chosen themselves. When dawn broke and pale light filtered through the curtains, I rose earlier than usual, not to begin another day of service, but to begin something new for myself, something quiet and certain. I moved slowly through rooms I had known intimately, walking past the living room, the kitchen, the hallways where laughter and noise once echoed, now silent, almost hollow. I reached for a suitcase tucked away in the closet, the one I had bought for small trips years ago, and I carried it to the bed. I placed it open and began to fold my garments, each shirt, each dress, each small piece of clothing, folding into itself with intention, as though with each fold I was gathering pieces of who I had forgotten I was. I paused as I folded the clothes I'd bought to please her, the pajamas I used for late-night care, the soft scarf I kissed her cheek with after school, all of them reminders of a life of giving. I laid them gently in the suitcase, sometimes lingering on a piece as memory surfaced, sometimes pressing them down with resolve. I picked up the thank you drawings, the ones taped to the wall in the younger one's room, the ones with my name written in crayon, and placed them carefully atop the folded clothes. I wanted to carry with me the proof that I had mattered in someone's small world, that somewhere beneath the cruelty was love that had been real. I found the house keys next, keys I had held for years, keys that unlocked doors to homework, to laundry, to warming dinners, and I placed them on the counter, beside the pile of drawings, beside the empty coffee mugs she had forgotten to put away. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what I was doing. Leaving without announcement, without apology, without tears. I closed the suitcase quietly, sealing a chapter I had once hoped would last forever. Before I left, I stood in the center of the living room, letting my gaze pass over the walls, the furniture, the little signs of life I had lived there with them. And I whispered under my breath, I have loved with everything I am. Now it is time to love myself. I opened the front door, the morning air cool on my face, and I walked out without turning back, suitcase in hand, the house behind me full of memories and of silence. The morning was still when I stepped outside, the kind of stillness that feels like the world is holding its breath. And for a moment I simply stood there with the suitcase by my side, the chill in the air wrapping around me like a reminder that change is never easy. But it is sometimes necessary. I walked slowly down the path I had taken thousands of times before, each step echoing louder in my heart than in my ears, because I knew this time I would not be coming back. The street was quiet, lined with houses where curtains were still drawn, neighbors still asleep, unaware that I was carrying away not just clothes, but years of my life, years of devotion, years of sacrifice. My hands tightened around the handle of the suitcase, and I thought about the countless mornings I had walked this same path with grocery bags, with tired arms carrying supplies for the household, with lists of things that needed to be done running through my mind, but this time there was nothing waiting for me, only the sound of my own footsteps and the calm of choosing a different direction. When I reached the corner, I paused and looked back at the house, its windows still dark, its doors closed, and I felt a pang deep in my chest, not of regret, but of finality. The kind of knowing that tells you some chapters must be closed without fanfare, without applause, just quietly. I whispered a goodbye that no one heard. A goodbye not just to a home but to the part of myself that had stayed far too long in shadows of unappreciation. Then I turned away and kept walking, step by step, toward the small bus station at the edge of town. As I waited, the cold metal of the bench pressing against my palms, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years, and it felt like exhaling a weight that had lived in my chest for too long. When the bus arrived, I climbed aboard with my suitcase, found a seat by the window, and watched the town roll past, familiar streets giving way to fields, then to stretches of open road. Each mile carried me further from the life that had defined me only by what I gave, and closer to the quiet possibility of a life defined by who I was. I arrived in the next town where an old friend lived, someone who had always seen me as more than what I could do for others, someone whose arms opened with warmth the moment she saw me standing at her door. For the first time in years, I felt the safety of being welcomed without conditions, the comfort of being seen as a person, not as a service. Sitting at her kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea that she had brewed for me, not the other way around, I felt the truth settle into me. I had been more than a glorified babysitter all along. I had been a woman with a heart that gave endlessly, and now it was my turn to give back to myself. The first evening in my friend's home felt strange at first, almost too quiet, almost too easy, as though I was waiting for someone to call my name or hand me a list of things that needed to be done. But nothing came, only the gentle sound of the clock on her wall and the soft clinking of cups as she poured us tea. I sat at her table, my suitcase tucked neatly by the door, and for the first time in years I felt like a guest instead of a servant, like someone whose presence was enough without effort, and I let that feeling wash over me in waves. That night, I lay down in her spare bedroom, the sheets crisp and cool, and I stared at the ceiling for a long time, marveling at the silence, at the absence of footsteps outside the door, of ringing phones demanding I answer, of voices calling me into another task. The silence was not empty. It was healing. It was a reminder that I still had a life of my own to live, that I had worth beyond my usefulness, and as I closed my eyes, I felt a kind of peace I had forgotten was possible. The next morning, the phone began to ring, her name flashing across the screen again and again, each call louder not in sound, but in memory, and I watched the screen light up before me with trembling hands, knowing full well that once upon a time I would have answered without hesitation. But now I let it ring, once, twice, 10 times, until it finally went silent. My friend looked at me across the table and said nothing, and that silence was a gift, because she knew I needed no advice, no push, only the freedom to decide for myself. I thought about the irony of it all, how she had once laughed and called me a glorified babysitter, and now here she was, unable to keep her own household standing without me. The calls kept coming through the day, each one ignored, each one a reminder that walking away had been the truest answer I could give. Later that afternoon, I went for a walk through my friend's neighborhood, the streets unfamiliar yet welcoming, and as I breathed in the fresh air, I realized that I was lighter, my steps no longer heavy with obligation. I passed gardens blooming with colors, children riding their bicycles freely, neighbors waving kindly, and it struck me how different life looked when you weren't burdened by someone else's demands. I whispered to myself that my worth was not tied to folded laundry or prepared meals, not tied to early mornings or sleepless nights. My worth was in my heart, in my resilience, in the love I carried within me whether it was seen or not. When I returned to the house, the phone was flashing again. Another call, another desperate attempt, and still I did not answer. Because sometimes silence speaks louder than any words you could say. That night as I sat by the window, tea warming my hands, I thought of how she must be pacing, how she must be realizing that without me the routines had crumbled, the comfort had vanished, and perhaps for the first time she was beginning to understand the weight of what I had given. And yet, I felt no urge to rush back, no pull to rescue her again, because I knew now that my silence was not cruelty, it was clarity. It was the space I needed to breathe, to remember who I was before I allowed myself to be reduced to nothing more than a title spoken with disdain. Days began to pass in my friend's home. And with each one, I felt myself slowly loosening the grip of the life I had left behind, as though invisible chains that had bound me for years were finally falling away, one by one, with every sunrise. The mornings no longer demanded that I rise before the sun to prepare breakfasts and pack bags. Instead, I woke when my body was ready. The light of the day spilling gently into the room, not as a summons to work, but as an invitation to simply exist. I would sit at the kitchen table, tea in my hands, and listen to the quiet hum of the world outside, the sound of birds, the occasional passing car, and I would marvel at how foreign peace had become to me, how easily I had forgotten what it felt like to live without constant duty. Each sip of tea tasted like freedom. Each deep breath felt like a piece of my spirit returning home. And with every hour that passed, I could hear the voice inside me growing stronger, the voice that had been silenced beneath exhaustion and dismissal for far too long. Yet even as I embraced this newfound calm, the phone continued to ring, her name lighting up the screen like a stubborn shadow refusing to let go. I would see it flash across the table, sometimes in the morning, sometimes late into the night, and I would let it ring until it stopped, my hand hovering but never reaching, because I knew that answering would mean surrendering. It would mean slipping back into the role she had so carelessly reduced me to. There were moments when guilt tried to creep in, when I thought of the children asking where I had gone, their small voices searching for me in rooms that now stood empty, and my heart would ache in ways I cannot describe. But I reminded myself that love without respect is not love at all, and that by walking away I was teaching a lesson no words could carry. A lesson she needed to learn, even if it came wrapped in silence. I began filling my days with small joys I had once abandoned, reading books that had sat untouched for years, tending to a small garden my friend shared with me, letting my fingers press into the soil and feeling life push up from the earth, as though it too was reminding me that growth is always possible, even after neglect. I took long walks in the evenings, the cool air brushing against my skin, and I thought about the woman I had been before I gave everything away, before I let myself become invisible under the weight of someone else's needs. Slowly I felt her returning, not the weary, diminished version, but the strong, whole woman who had lived through hardship and still carried love in her chest. And as I sat one evening by the window, the last rays of the sun spilling gold across the horizon, I whispered to myself that I was not gone. I was not lost. I was not broken. I was simply becoming again. The phone rang once more on the table behind me, sharp and insistent, but I did not turn. I did not move. I simply let it ring, because I finally understood that silence was not my weakness, it was my strength. And in that silence, I was reclaiming the dignity I had almost forgotten was mine. With every call I refused to answer, the weight shifted, not onto me but back where it belonged, onto her shoulders, and soon the ripples of my absence began to show. I heard through a cousin that the mornings in that house were chaos now, that without my steady hands to guide the rhythm, the days began late, with rushed voices, misplaced shoes, and tears at the door before anyone was even out of the house. I imagined her fumbling in the kitchen, burning toast, forgetting where the lunch boxes were kept. The groceries running thin because I was no longer the one making lists and stretching every dollar to keep the shelves full. I thought of the evenings too, when tiredness hung heavy in the air, and there was no warm dinner waiting, no folded laundry stacked neatly, no steady voice humming softly in the background, only exhaustion and the sharp edge of a life she thought she could balance without me. I knew the children must have asked about me, their voices soft at first, wondering when I would be back, and then louder, demanding answers that she did not want to give. I pictured her brushing off their questions, telling them I was fine, that I was just away for a while. But deep down, she must have felt the sting of their disappointment, because they had felt my presence every day for years. And now, they were feeling the hollow space I had left behind. Without me, the house was no longer a home stitched together by unseen effort. It was just walls and noise. And I knew she was beginning to realize the cost of the words she had spoken so carelessly that night. She posted online, desperate, asking if anyone had seen me. Her words painted with worry. But I knew the truth. It was not worry for my safety that drove her. It was worry for herself. for the weight of her life without me to carry it. Relatives began calling, their voices tinged with concern. Not because they thought I was lost, but because they could hear the panic in her voice, the way her pride had been stripped away by the silence I left in my wake. She must have paced the floors, the phone clutched in her hand, dialing again and again, her calls stretching into the night. And each time I let the screen light up and fade away, each unanswered ring teaching her a truth sharper than any words I could have spoken. I did not feel cruelty in holding back. I felt clarity, for I understood at last that love is not proven by how much you endure, but by knowing when to stop enduring. I had carried her life for 6 years, each day without asking for anything in return, and in one careless moment, she had reduced me to nothing. So now she had to feel the weight of what it meant to live without me. And as she struggled, as she reached out in panic, I found myself sitting more peacefully with each passing day. Not because I wanted her to suffer, but because I wanted her to finally see me. Not as a babysitter, not as free labor, but as the woman who had given everything, and who finally decided she was worth more than being laughed at in her own home. As the days turned into weeks, her desperation grew louder, though I still never picked up the phone, and in that silence, I began to see the truth of what my absence meant. Relatives told me that her voice no longer carried the pride it once did. That the same woman who laughed on the phone about me being just a glorified babysitter was now sounding frantic, her words edged with guilt and fear, asking if anyone had heard from me, if anyone knew where I was. She must have sat in her living room staring at the spot where I usually folded laundry, the kitchen counter where I used to stand with my hands busy, the empty chair at the table where I always sat with a gentle smile. And I imagined she began to realize that I had never been just a presence filling space. I had been the rhythm, the steady heart of her household. And without me, everything felt unbalanced. I received a message one evening, not through a call but written out in halting words, the kind of message that tries to hold on to pride but cannot quite mask the cracks underneath. She wrote that she was sorry, that she hadn't meant what she said, that she was just tired and stressed and it slipped out. But I could hear the tremor of fear beneath her apology, fear that perhaps I would never come back. I read her words again and again, and my heart ached because apologies after the damage has been done are like rain falling on soil that has already turned to stone, too late to nourish, too late to grow what has already withered. I thought back to that night in the hallway. How easily the words had rolled from her tongue, wrapped in laughter, spoken not once in anger but in casual cruelty. And I asked myself if forgiveness could erase that moment. The answer rose inside me like a steady tide. No, forgiveness may ease the ache, but it could not undo the truth she revealed about how she truly saw me. And so I chose not to reply, not because I wanted to punish her, but because I understood that my silence was the clearest boundary I could draw, the strongest way to protect the piece of myself I had finally reclaimed. I had spent years believing that my love was enough to make me valued, that by giving endlessly I would be seen as irreplaceable. But now I understood that love without respect becomes chains, and I had broken mine by walking away. Each time I looked at her messages piling up, I felt not guilt but resolve. A quiet assurance that by not responding, I was teaching her something words could never teach. I began to reflect on the meaning of family, how it is not just about blood but about honor, about respect, about seeing one another as whole people rather than tools of convenience. For years I had allowed her to shape me into what she needed, and in the process I had shrunk smaller and smaller until I was only what she wanted to see. But in walking away I was expanding again, remembering my own worth, rediscovering the strength I had always carried. I told myself that if I ever truly wanted to change, she would have to find that realization, not through my guidance, but through the hollow quiet my absence left behind. And as I sat one evening with the golden light of sunset pouring across the table where I now sipped tea in peace, I whispered to myself that forgiveness did not have to mean return, that sometimes the greatest act of love for yourself is to let the phone keep ringing, and to find comfort, not in reconciliation, but in the dignity of silence. In the weeks that followed, I began to settle into a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and deeply comforting. A rhythm that belonged to me and no one else. And with each passing day, I discovered pieces of myself that I had set aside for far too long. I found joy in small, simple things, like sitting by the window with a book that had been gathering dust for years, or taking long walks in the evening when the sky turned pink and gold, the air cool against my skin, reminding me that I was still alive, still capable of enjoying moments just for myself. I began tending to the little garden behind my friend's house, pressing my fingers into the soil, feeling its richness, and watching the first signs of green break through the earth, as though they were whispering to me that growth is always possible, no matter how long you've been buried under neglect. With every flower that bloomed, I felt something bloom inside me too, a soft but steady reminder that my life had value beyond what I gave to others, that I was more than the hands that cooked and cleaned, more than the voice that soothed fevers in the night. The silence that once felt heavy in those first nights now became my closest companion. A silence filled not with loneliness, but with peace. A silence that allowed me to hear my own thoughts without interruption. A silence that healed the parts of me that had been worn thin by constant demands. I began laughing again. Truly laughing. Not the tired chuckle I used to force when she brushed past me, but a laugh that rose naturally when my friend and I shared old stories. When we remembered the young women we once were, and the dreams we once held. That laughter felt like medicine, mending the cracks in my spirit, one by one. And it made me realize that life was not over for me, that it was simply changing into something new, something freer. Meanwhile, the calls and messages continued to come, sometimes desperate, sometimes apologetic, sometimes quiet and short, as though she didn't know what else to say. But no matter how many times the phone lit up, I held to my resolve, because I understood now that my worth was not measured by how quickly I ran back when called, but by how firmly I could stand in the choice to protect my own heart. And each time I let the phone ring unanswered, I felt stronger, as though every silence was building a wall of dignity around me, a wall that kept out the voices that once diminished me. I thought often about the words she had spoken, how casually they had rolled off her tongue, and I knew that if I returned too quickly, nothing would change. The words would only return in new shapes, and I would once again find myself erased. By staying away, by embracing the life I was creating for myself, I was not just teaching her a lesson, I was teaching myself one too. That I deserved more, that I was more, and that love without respect is a shadow that drains you until you forget the warmth of the sun. And now, sitting by the window in the golden light of evening, tea warm in my hands, I no longer felt invisible. I no longer felt reduced to a role. I felt whole again, and I whispered softly to myself that walking away had not been the end of my story. It had been the beginning of finally choosing me. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the light softened across the horizon, I sat quietly with the phone in front of me, her name flashing again and again, and I watched it ring without lifting a finger. There was no anger left in me, only a calm knowing that I no longer needed to prove my worth to anyone, that by walking away I had finally shown myself the respect I had been denied for so long. The silence was not empty, it was powerful. It was the sound of me reclaiming my life, and I understood that sometimes the greatest answer is the one you never give. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I am grateful for your time and your heart. And if this story touched you in any way, please subscribe so you can walk with me through more truths still to come.